Hello, everyone. This is going to be 1.1, The People of the Americas. And we're going to start, like we always are going to start for the rest of the year, with a primary source, something from the time period. Usually, this will be a piece of writing in some way, shape, or form. However, since we don't have writing, or at least none that we can understand from pre Columbian times, we are going to start with what's called an artifact, something left over from them. So, this is Monk's Mound from Cahokia, Illinois. It is the largest pre Columbian earthwork, although we have several all around the country. It is the largest pyramid structure in the United States as well, and it was created by the Mississippians in about 900 to 950 in the Common Era. So, our objectives, another thing we're going to have in every single lecture. And these can be helpful, by the way, because if you're wondering, did I get the most important aspects of the chapter, you can always look back at the objectives and see if you can say that we did all these things. So, for instance, we are going to explain how American Indians may have come to North America. We're going to describe the process by which different groups and cultures developed, and we're going to describe the major culture areas prior to the arrival of the Europeans in North America. So first, we're going to look at the earliest inhabitants of the Americas. Some scholars refer to the first people in America as Paleo-Indians. This book refers to them quite often as American Indians. Other people call them First Peoples, Native Americans, so on and so forth. Now, most people believe that they came to America by way of northern Russia, although not everyone believes this. In fact, new evidence says it may not actually be true. Scholars also disagree as exactly when they came over. So, until recently, it was believed that the first Americans were hunters who crossed from Russia to Alaska over a frozen piece of ice and land known as the Bering Land Bridge. You can no longer take this road, and some people say you may not have been able to take it even back then too. About 15,000 years ago, we were in the midst of an ice age, which lowered sea levels and exposed this Bering Land Bridge. Now, more recent archaeologists believe that the first peoples who arrived in America migrated or traveled about 40,000 years ago, and they didn't cross the Bering Strait, this red line that you see here on the map. Instead, they used small boats to travel down the west coast of America, the blue line that you see there. And eventually they moved all the way to North, South, and Central America. So about 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, give or take, the Ice Age started to end. The Bering Land Bridge went away. It melted the ice, the sea levels came back up. And America was cut off from the rest of the world. And so the Paleo-Indians that lived here hunted the giant animals that used to live here to absolute extinction. And after that, tribes had to survive on smaller game. They had to do hunting of smaller animals, deer, things like that, fishing, gathering. And most of these most of these peoples were nomadic, meaning they moved from place to place. However, we do start to see agriculture begin to appear over time. Most people believe in the area that today is Mexico, and people used agriculture and they started to settle into cities. We see this with the Aztec especially. And eventually, these tribes began to migrate and expand throughout the Americas. So, as the population grew, tribes became much more diverse based upon their beliefs, geographic locations. It is wrong to think that every single Native American tribe is like every other Native American tribe. They are different based on geography, they're different based on religion, and many, many other things. So by 1492, there were at least 375, probably more, distinct languages throughout what is today America, and many different cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, and each nation was further divided into tribes, mostly led by a chief and advised by tribal elders. Here on the map, you see several areas and where the major tribes were in America. So as these tribes grew, they also domesticated wild plants, meaning that they could farm. This was better because it meant that you could settle down in one place and have a reliable form of gathering food. And so we start to see that some tribes became actually large and powerful empires during that time. In central Mexico, about 3,500 years ago, the growing of corns and beans and squash, the Three Sisters, as they're called, helped to form large cities surrounding them. So we had the Maya on the coast of Mexico. In central Mexico, the Aztec were the most powerful. And both were known for creating very large pyramids with temples, and agriculture helped to make them powerful. This spread out of Mexico eventually into the Americas, although some tribes did remain nomadic instead. So here we see the Aztecs in green and the Mayans in yellow along the Gulf of Mexico there. This is Chichen Itza, which was built by the Mayans, and of course, some history channels which have you believe that it was actually built by ancient aliens, but not really. This is Teotihuacan in Mexico, built by the Aztecs, with the Temple of the Sun in the background, also not built by aliens. Sorry to burst your enthusiasm for history, but let's get back to factual stuff. Other things, let's look at early cultures in North America. About 2,000 years ago, permanent villages were built around America. Now, it is important to remember that, like I said earlier, it's a bad idea to overgeneralize things. If you're talking about Native Americans, you're not talking about one group or one tribe or one nation. You're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of different tribes, each with their own beliefs and ways of living. Tribes lived very differently. They worshiped differently. They hunted differently. And so let's take a look at a few geographic areas. First of all, in the Southwest, you had groups like the Hohokams. In modern-day Arizona, they used the rivers to cut irrigation trails and dams to help water their crops and give them drinking water. Tribes in the Southwest generally lived near whatever rivers they could find. They built their homes out of what's called adobe, which is a dried clay brick. Some homes were actually quite tall, several stories tall. The Anasazi tribe built their homes in canyons using sandstone blocks to build the houses that they find there. Eventually, geographic changes and climate change led to both of these guys moving about 1100 AD. What was left of the Anasazi eventually became the Pueblo tribe, which still exists up through today. So here you can see the Hohokam, the Pueblans, and a group known as the Mugians as well. So here is Casa Grande National Monument with some Hohokam remains. Hohokam's hard to say, and these are made of adobe. This is Mesa Verde National Park with cliff dwellings left over. You can see that they are multi-story as well. Now, in the Midwest, we have the Mississippians. We don't know what they called themselves because they disappeared, but we call them the Mississippians because they mainly lived along the Mississippi River or other river tributaries. They built very large towns surrounding earth pyramids. The largest of this, of course, is Cahokia, which was built right around 1000 in the Common Era across the river from St. Louis in Illinois. The rivers in the area helped to keep the soil fertile, which meant that they could grow things there. This also allowed for travel and trade, and we know for a fact that they did it because we have found artifacts in Cahokia that do not come from there, that actually come from quite far away. So we know that Cahokia was actually a trading hub during this time. So we also see that eventually the people left. Before Columbus got here, the Mississippians had disappeared, probably due to environmental changes like overpopulation or using the soil too much. This eventually caused them to migrate to other areas, to where we do not know. Here's another mound, the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio from another Mississippian culture. Now, in the Great Plains, which is the area between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, places like Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, Oklahoma, fields were generally very grassy, but also relatively dry. Did not get a lot of rain there. So in the Great Plains, they were mainly nomadic, and they survived by hunting the millions of bison that lived in the Great Plains. Some tribes would live in beehive structures that gave them good ventilation in the south. Other tribes in the north lived in log houses, but both of these could be, if necessary, abandoned to move elsewhere. So here is generally where the Great Plains are in the United States. This is one of those beehive-style dwellings that I was talking about. And while out on the hunt, the Great Plains warriors lived in mobile camps with what we call today teepees, which are cone-shaped tents made out of animal hide. These tribes also clashed with the western nomads, the Apache, who lived in what is New Mexico and Arizona today. However, it's not always warfare either. It's wrong to think that, tribes were constantly warring with each other. They would, but they also would sometimes have peace. They would trade. Sometimes they would actually form sort of groups and alliances as well. But when they were being good with each other, they would trade meat for crops. They would trade, goods for goods, whatever it might be. However, when trade was in short supply, that's when war happened. So here are some Great Plains hunters, and you notice that they are going after the bison on foot, or actually on hands and knees in this painting. That's because horses didn't exist in America until the Europeans came over. In the east, we have the woodland tribes. They made their homes in huge forests, and so southeast we have the Cherokee. Nowadays, back then they lived in the Tennessee and the Carolinas. These days they live in Oklahoma after the Trail of Tears. Other tribes were like the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Natchez, the Creek Indians. These tribes mainly were farmers, but also hunters as well. In the northeast, you had two big tribes, the Algonquin, who lived in what is today Virginia, and the Iroquois Nation, the Iroquois Confederacy, or League, which lived in the Great Lakes region in New York State today. Algonquins lived in oval wigwams. Meanwhile, the Iroquois lived in what are called long houses, these very long wooden buildings, about 200 feet long. Now, many of these Iroquois groups eventually came to form an Iroquois League, what we call a confederacy. They sort of banded together for mutual protection and to trade with each other. And it had a word-of-mouth constitution. This is what we call an oral tradition. They didn't write it down because they didn't have writing back then, but they did pass down their tradition and their sort of laws and bylaws and constitution through oral tradition. So this is an Algonquin wigwam, and this is what an Iroquois longhouse looked like. Now, although they were different in many ways, many tribes did share some similar traits. So usually, instead of having one king, power was more spread out, with smaller groups, each of them led by a chief. Most tribes also believed in some form of religious beliefs, generally involving spirits. They believed that all things around them in the world, both living, like plants and animals, and non-living, like rocks, had life inside them, spirits inside them, and these spirits were to be worshipped and thanked, and so on and so forth. The spiritual leaders who could do this, known as shamans, were very important for being able to communicate with these spirits to ensure their blessings. Also, most land was held as a common resource, so it wasn't like my family owns land or my house or my apartment or whatever. The tribe sort of doled out land as necessary based on the need of families. Europeans, when they came over, thought this was very strange, and it kind of took them by surprise. Europeans coming over and basically planting a flag and saying, all this land is now mine, didn't really compute with Native American ways of thinking. In Native culture, though, men hunted and women generally were the gatherers, although this is not always true. Women, however, who did stay in the home when the men went away to hunt, they had to run things, so women actually had a lot of power within the tribes, as they were the ones who were there. And we will take a look at more Native Americans in class as well.